Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Ideas Matter. Today, we're discussing The Prince by Machiavelli. Alex and I discuss Machiavelli's main message for rulers. We discuss whether or not Machiavelli is a moral or immoral thinker. We also look at some tensions between historical versus philosophical readings of the text and how to approach political leadership, and whether or not Machiavelli is relevant to contemporary domestic and international politics. Just a few notes before we begin. We're now distributing the podcast through Substack. I'll provide a link to the Substack in the episode description. You'll also find in the Substack book reviews on some books that we've been reading that we won't be doing podcast episodes on, so there's more in the Substack than just the podcast. We're also now uploading our episodes onto YouTube if you prefer to listen to podcasts. That way you can also find every episode now on YouTube as well. And just a quick note on the audio for today's episode. Alex is calling in from Europe, so the audio quality is not as good as usual, but we hope that it doesn't detract from your enjoyment. Thanks for listening.
G'day everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Ideas Matter podcast. We're back a lot sooner than we usually are.
I know, it feels good to be doing an episode every 2 weeks rather than every 2 months.
Yeah, hot off the presses with a new run. Now, this time we're doing, as we promised, The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli, aka Tupac Shakur's alter ego, Machiavelli, the release of his, I believe, final studio album, The Don Illuminati. Good album. But anyways, we're talking about the book, and maybe we'll go to the album as a tie-in a bit later. Yeah, The Prince, this is a massive one in terms of political philosophy, and as Louis would have a lot more experience in IR theory. So what's the reputation of this work? Because its reputation does precede it.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think The Prince is one of those interesting books that sort of makes its way onto everyone's reading list in a vast variety of disciplines. It's also one of those philosophy books that has the unfortunate reputation as also being a self-help book, rightly or wrongly. I think I was joking to you a few weeks ago that every time I see online a top 10 philosophy books you should read, but it's not put up by a philosopher, you can invariably guess at least 5 of those books, and they're usually, The Republic by Plato, The Prince by Machiavelli, and then some books that aren't actually philosophy books at all, like How to Stop Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson.
There's always invariably Marcus Aurelius.
Oh, yeah, the Stoics, of course. Those people love the Stoics. And they also love The Prince.
No, they don't actually read Epictetus and Seneca.
Oh, no,
they just Marcus Aurelius.
Of course, it's just the one book by Marcus Aurelius. But yeah, it's one of those books that has a wide audience, which, look, I know you really enjoyed it.
I loved it.
I'm not going to say I didn't enjoy it, but I thought it didn't really live up to the hype, if I'm honest. But that being said, I still think it was worthwhile reading, and it's still worthwhile doing a podcast on because it's just so influential, and there are a lot of great, pithy one-liners in the book, such as, it is better to be feared than to be loved, things like that.
What was it that you didn't enjoy so much about it? You said you still did enjoy it, but what kind of detracted for you?
There was just a lot of discussing various campaigns of city-states in Italy and papal states, of, how rulers kept them and how they lost them, and these historical asides, which I didn't necessarily. Look, they're sort of the basis for the advice that he's giving out, but I was more interested in the sort of general observations he was making about political power and how to be a ruler than the historical stuff. But I think you enjoyed the historical stuff, right?
Yeah, that's a big part of why I actually enjoyed it quite a lot. So I thought it was really good in grounding it. It shows where he saw this happening in practice, in his personal experience as a high-level government official in Florence, and also in his experience of, studying the ancient world, which he draws on quite a bit. But Well, it's the main point of the book, which is if you want to be a ruler, don't worry too much about being a nice guy.
Yes.
That's my one sentence colloquial version of what people think of this book, or may even be if you want to be a ruler, be bad. You should be an evil guy.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
does that bear in? What's the actual message of the book?
I mean, I think that's probably a pretty good way of describing it. I think Machiavelli's main point, and I jotted down a quote that I think accurately sums this up, where he says, if a prince wants to maintain his rule, he must be prepared not to be virtuous. And so the idea he's getting at here is if you want to be successful in politics, sometimes you're going to have to do things that normal people would regard as quote unquote evil or cruel, but that's a necessity in politics. And so I basically thought that the summary of The Prince really is that the first task of politics is to establish political order. It's to establish stability, because you can't have law, you can't have morality, you can't have a well-functioning society unless you have stability. And stability really is underpinned by violence. And so if you're going to be a good ruler, it's no use ignoring that fact. You should be prepared to engage in violence when it's necessary, if it's in the greater interests of peace and stability.
Yeah, it's something that feels very counter to the assumptions we're brought up with about how people should act, especially in public life. But I think he makes a pretty convincing case for why that is the case. He, near the start, talks about the futility of philosophers and such making political observations or writing books about political action, where you first go from your sort of ethical principles and then go into, okay, and this is how politics should work. Whereas he's saying, no, you should go the other way around. You should look at how the realities of how political life actually works. And then from there, we can gather some principles and see what's right, what's wrong, and what we should do. That I thought was very refreshing. I wasn't expecting to see something this sort of clear-minded and cold-blooded almost from this era. Because you think of like, oh, this is something that's been written in like the early 1500s, and you think it'd be, you know, peons to Catholicism and it's some sort of like Renaissance humanist stuff going on maybe. But it's remarkably modern in its outlook, or at least that's how it seems to me compared to some of the other things you read from this era.
That's an interesting point. I have heard that said before, that Machiavelli is sort of the beginning of modern political philosophy. I think it was perhaps Quentin Skinner, who's an intellectual historian, made that point. But that's interesting that you noticed that he said that you shouldn't begin from ethical principles and then discuss, well, here's how politics should be, and you should basically try and like bend your behavior to fit those maxims. I didn't notice that line when I was reading it, which is good that, you know, that you picked it up. But yeah, I mean, I guess that is partly what makes it so modern, because if you read The Republic by Plato, I mean, that is essentially how political philosophy of that sort progresses. It's what is our ideal? What is our ideal state? What is our ideal ethical system? And then you sort of generate that in the abstract, right? And then once you've got that ideal, you set about trying to achieve it in reality. But to Machiavelli, I mean, that's a road that's going to lead you towards catastrophe if you ignore the realities of your situation and the realities of power politics. And so I guess that's why Machiavelli is regarded as, you know, one of the founders of realpolitik.
Yeah. And he, going into sort of like the principles that he outlines in the text, there's a really good one around that idea where he says, if there's let's say there's a prince who is virtuous all the time and a prince who is unvirtuous all the time, that unvirtuous prince is going to defeat that virtuous prince just by the realities of political power, by the sort of, you know, sacrifices you have to make. You have to do things that are bad for other people in order to maintain your own power. So if you're unscrupulous, you're always going to have a sort of advantage over someone who's concerned first and foremost with going about their businesses in an ethical way.
Yeah. He does definitely say that. I mean, to play the devil's advocate, I mean, I know Machiavelli has an answer to this, but I think this is a nice way to get into what underpins his worldview is his view of human nature. So, how would Machiavelli respond to the argument that, oh, but the virtuous leader is going to be more loved by his citizens, and therefore he'll be able to command greater loyalty than the cruel tyrant. So might be better to be a virtuous, kind leader than
Is that a bit of Confucianism I'm hearing?
It might be, yeah, it might be Machiavelli talking to Confucius, perhaps a little bit. But you would hear other people say that argument too. Perhaps a naive liberal might make that argument. So, how would Machiavelli respond to that view?
Well, I think he'd say that's all well and good to be virtuous, but you have to get to a point in terms of your own political stability where you can actually exercise your virtue. There's a good example he brings up about the Roman emperors. There's a period in Roman history of what's called I forgot if it's 4 or 5 good emperors, the last of which was Marcus Aurelius. And then it kind of goes into a decline of very violent, tyrannical emperors. And he talks about the contrast between these. And he says, when Marcus Aurelius took the mantle of emperor, it was sort of handed down to him. There wasn't really a succession struggle. So he had institutional control over the army. He had institutional control over the people. So he didn't have to worry too much about the sort of, grimy political operations and the like that you have to do to establish power. So he could, because his power was so secure, he could worry, he could turn his concern to being the virtuous, philosopher, king, ruler. Whereas the ones that came after him came to power other than his son, they came to power through struggles and trying to get hold of the army's attention rather than the people, because they need it for power. And by doing so, they lose the support of the people and turns even bloodier and whatnot. So in terms of Machiavelli's view, he's not saying don't act virtuously. He's like, if you can get to that point, of course, you should do it. But it's just a matter of recognizing where you are and if you can afford to be like that.
Oh yeah, for sure. But I also think it's interesting that his view on human nature, where he says that he's like, we can say this about humans, they are fickle, they are self-interested. A lot of this is sort of like preempting Hobbes and later sort of like state of nature thinking, right? Where the view of human nature is, I don't want to say pessimistic, but
very cynical.
Cynical, and views humans as basically self-interested and in a sense rational. And here's this really interesting bit where he says, well, really, it's better to be feared than to be loved, but being feared doesn't necessarily mean being hated. And the main task of a ruler is to avoid being hated. And he has this really interesting statement, which I'm not entirely sure I agree with, but he says that, someone will sooner forget you killing their father than you taking their private property. And so it's better for a ruler to come in and to execute people to maintain his rule than it is to sort of have an overbearing state that engages in lots of taxation, for example. I mean, so this is a view of human nature where people really care about their stuff, about their private property. It's a very proto-materialist view of politics, which views humans as basically self-interested. I mean, you can already see how, in terms of Alex and I are reading this text, Alex is taking the more historical approach, whereas I'm drawing out these political philosophical lessons, which we're going to go into later, these two various readings. But yeah, what do you think about that cynical take on human nature?
Well, I'm inclined somewhat to agree with it, but I don't know. I'm just going off the cuff here, but I don't know if I'd wholesale go with the view that Machiavelli holds. But I don't know. This is going into the sort of historical versus philosophical thing, but I can see how he got these ideas historically. He talks about historical figures like Julius Caesar and uses them as examples. He says, well, with Caesar, the reason why he got murdered wasn't so much because he was gaining so much power. it's because he was taking so much property from the patricians. He was taxing them so heavily so he could shore up his power base in the people. He said that sort of going after the private property of the powerful class of people that he's trying to outmaneuver ended up being his downfall. And you can look at other kind of examples in history where going after private property is sort of the death knell for rulers. If not death knell, causes big problems. I'm reading a book on the Habsburgs at the moment because I'm in Central Europe, and there's quite a few moments in there where Habsburg, during the Protestant Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, Habsburgs are going after the property of Protestant nobles and the like to kind of curtail their influence. But it just sort of inflames them even further because, well, you took my shit. That's not just, I think in the level of sort of like, in a historical sense and in political life, these questions of private property aren't just about like, I like having stuff, but it is tied in with these views of political survival. Like, I need to have this private property, because when we're talking about things on this scale, like Machiavelli and, you know, big picture politics, taking private property isn't just like, I'm going to repossess your flat. It's, I'm going to take your fief. I'm going to take these monasteries that pay tribute to you and that you get money from. And that is very intimately tied in with these ideas of political survival and political life that he talks about. These things are necessary for power and to exercise power. So I think that's kind of where he's coming from with that.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think really the key there is that like these things, as you said, are not just stuff, they're means to survival. So survival is really the highest, or I guess not the highest, but the primary goal of humans, and thus at a higher level of states and countries. And so nothing else can be satisfied until you satisfy that fundamental goal of security, which, as we'll see later, has obviously had a lasting influence on the field of international relations realism. But on the point about history, I mean, I think you're right. I think it's also interesting to observe that these thinkers who say these sort of cynical things that we might sort of instinctively recoil from, to pay attention to what they in their own life have been observing. I mean, so Machiavelli is in a time where the transfer of power between rulers is not necessarily always peaceful, whereas today, at least in the West, it is. And similarly with Hobbes, who makes very similar arguments to Machiavelli. I mean, he's writing after the English Civil War. So people are responding to the political problems of their time, right? They're not doing abstract political philosophy. They're doing quite practical problem solving.
Yeah, it does really bear out in his life. You can see where he got these ideas from. Like we mentioned earlier, he was a big player in the Florentine political scene when it was a republic. And then the republic got taken over by a noble family. And I think he got arrested and tortured, and he dealt with invasions. And at the time, Renaissance Italy was a really big scene for great power politics, you know, between Venice, between the Ottomans, between France, between the Habsburgs. So in the middle of all this tumult, I can see how he was really focusing on these ideas of, well, shit, how does power operate? How do you rule? Yeah, that's
really,
why
was he tortured?
Yeah, he was tortured when he was arrested. I think he was accused of conspiring to overthrow the rule of the Borgia family.
Oh, wow. That's so interesting.
Yeah. And then after he got tortured, he wrote up The Prince, and he tried to offer it to the new leader of Florence, you know, whoever the member of the Borgia family was. He was like, look, let's just forget about that torture and stuff. I want to come work for you. So I'll give you this as a kind of CV. And he didn't end up getting his job back, unfortunately.
That's so fascinating. I had no idea about all of that, but really that actually makes a lot of sense, because I think there's this sort of instinctive view amongst people today that, well, if someone's been exposed to torture or they've experienced what happens when state power goes rogue, they might, as a result, develop a worldview in which they want to constrain the power of the state, and they want to view politics as this ideal moral field. But actually, sometimes the reverse ends up happening. And a really interesting contemporary example of that is China's President Xi Jinping. A lot of people might not know that Xi Jinping's father was a member of the Communist Party during the Cultural Revolution, and was accused by Chairman Mao of being a counter-revolutionary, and was sent basically to a re-education camp. So his whole family was basically blacklisted by the Chinese Communist Party. And there's this fascinating story of where during the famine, during the Great Leap Forward, she was at school, and he basically ditched school one day. He ran home because there was no food at school and he was so hungry. And he ran home to his mother. And instead of his mother feeding him, his mother ratted him out to the local party secretary. And this is a guy's own mum whose husband whose husband has been sent to a re-education camp. And even she basically put her own political survival above the hunger of her own child. And so there was a view in the West that when Xi was coming to power in China, that he would be a reformer because he's experienced all the horrible aspects of China's political system. And obviously, as we now know, that's not been the case. He's a very pro-communist, pro-one-party state guy, and he has reformed the system, but not in the direction that Westerners thought he would. And there was this fascinating interview with Xi Jinping where he was asked about this, and he says, well, for a lot of people, political power is something abstract, but I've seen the gulags, I've seen the prison cells. And he said, that gave me a deeper understanding of politics than most people. This is what power is about. And so for people like Xi Jinping and for people like Machiavelli, this understanding of politics as power comes from personal experience, it seems.
Yeah, for sure. And you can see going from that, like having had those experiences, why they think, no, the expansion of power is good. Those experiences came about because of conflicts in power. You know, Machiavelli was sort of overthrown from government because of all these political machinations going on at the time. You know, Xi Jinping, you know, in the Cultural Revolution is kind of goes without saying, a period of massive upheaval. And the view of Machiavelli, and I guess from extension Xi Jinping, is you need as much security as possible to make sure that stuff doesn't happen anymore so people can live in peace.
Absolutely. And I think that's an excellent segue to a question that I think will be very interesting to discuss, because sort of Machiavellian, if someone's described as Machiavellian today, I mean, what's the assumption that you think they're saying? They're saying, oh, well, if someone is Machiavellian, they're sort of evil, they're cunning, they're scheming, they're not a nice guy, basically. You don't want to be described by someone as Machiavellian. And so when you read The Prince, I think it's an interesting question to pose. Is Machiavelli immoral, or is he amoral? So is morality irrelevant to him? Or is what he is describing actually a system of morality because he's interested in the bigger picture? I personally think that Machiavelli is quite a moral thinker because he is dealing with quite seriously this fundamental problem of politics, and that is, how do you gain power? How do you retain power? And then from there, how do you use that power in the interest of your subjects? And he recognizes that only once you've done that can you have the greater good. So everything he's saying is not just for the sake of it, right? It's in the interest of establishing peace and stability. And so I think that he's actually a moral thinker. Maybe he wouldn't have described himself as such. He wouldn't think he's doing moral philosophy, but I don't think it's correct to describe Machiavellian as evil. I think what he's actually aiming at is a good society in some ways.
Yeah, 100. I completely agree with that. When I was reading this, I was thinking, like, well, this is a guy who's genuinely concerned with the common good. Like the image of Machiavellian thought, of a Machiavellian operator, is like a supervillain. But yeah, he seems overwhelmingly concerned with making sure that there's peace and stability and people aren't dying in wars and getting tortured. part of that is arming yourself and being willing to fight and being willing to be this kind of wily, amoral political operator who's willing to do ugly things to maintain that control. But like you said, he always has an end goal in mind. The end goal is always, well, what is the best for both yourself as ruler and the people under you. And this gets into something that you mentioned, where you mentioned to me when we were discussing this episode, where you said that he's sort of a proto-utilitarian thinker, right?
Yeah, I mean that phrase proto-utilitarian actually comes from a first-year university essay that I wrote.
Oh, hell yeah.
In which I was armed with nothing other than, one or two chapters of Machiavelli, which I may or may not have read thoroughly, and the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on Machiavelli and utilitarianism. And I sort of hobbled together this essay that somehow managed to get a high distinction for arguing that no, Machiavelli is not a bad dude. He's a proto-utilitarian. And my view remains essentially unchanged. I think, yeah, he's someone who is aiming at the greater good. He wants stability. He wants peace. He just recognizes that to do that, you have to contend with the reality of human relations, and human relations are plagued by power politics and everyone's desire to survive. I think a great quote that really sums up his view on cruelty and violence is when he says that we can say that cruelty is used well when it is employed once for all, and one's safety depends on it, and then it is not persisted in, but as far as possible turned to the good of one's subjects. So there's a few things there where he says cruelty is only good when it's done once and for all. And so you don't want to just keep doing it for the sake of it, right? If you have to do something cruel, just do it once. It's like ripping off a Band-Aid, don't delay it. But you can only do it when your safety depends on it, because safety and security is the higher good. And then once you've done that, don't persist in it. So, I think that's a fairly moral idea. He's not just giving rulers like a carte blanche, rule to just be violent whenever they want. He's saying, no, these are the conditions in which you can be cruel. And if you're going to need to be cruel, then this is how you should do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I feel like that's really great advice as well. It kind of links in with another thing that he says earlier on about contending with political enemies, I believe internally, where he says, if you're going to move against your political enemies, you need to make sure that you do it fast, you do it all at once, and you don't do any half measures. If you're going to act, you're going to have to act to stop them completely. They have to be removed as far as possible from any position of being able to threaten you. If that involves having to execute some people who might have intentions of taking over your line, then hang on, I'm going to pause. Sorry, all right, let's get back to it. If that involves having to crack a couple eggs to do so, then, well, that's what you got to do, I suppose. And this leads on to another thing that we kind of touched on earlier about I can see you have the quote here in the Google Doc. By making an example or two, he will prove more compassionate than those who, being too compassionate, allow disorders which lead to murder and rapine. So again, going on this idea that you're going to have to think about doing some bad things in terms of the greater good.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it is really good advice that if you have to do something not nice, but that is necessary, do it quickly. No half measures, right?
Yeah.
One of my favorite episodes of Breaking Bad is when Mike is explaining to Walter, no half measures, right? Like, I feel like I can spoil the show. It's been out for how long now? Like 10 years, where he doesn't kill this guy who's beating his wife. And the guy goes, no, like, I'll never do it again. I'm sorry. So Mike shows mercy and doesn't kill him. And then a week later, that man kills his wife. And so the lesson that Mike draws from this is no half measures. And I think, it would make sense if in the Breaking Bad universe, Mike had read The Prince, because that is essentially what Machiavelli is arguing. There's another similar quote where he says, violence must be inflicted once for all. People will then forget what it tastes like and so be less resentful. Benefits must be conferred gradually, and in that way, they will taste better. So he thinks that if you basically do something mean once and quickly, in time, people will forget about it. But the same is also true of nice things. So if you're going to be good and kind to your rulers and generous, then you should do that gradually so they don't forget. There's a really interesting quote where he says, men must either be pampered or crushed. So he sort of paints this view of people as like not really having long memories and not really appreciating subtlety and nuance. If you have to do something, then yeah, no half measures. You got to go to the extreme of either side. So one of the things that you guys may have noticed in our discussion of this text is that the quotes that we've each drawn out or highlighted and the points that we're taking from it slightly differ. And I think that reflects our respective undergraduate trainings. Alex, you majored in history, is that right? Or was that a minor?
I actually majored in philosophy, but I did all of my electives in history. So I think I actually ended up doing more history subjects than philosophy.
Well, there you go. I mean, you're certainly more historically literate than I am, as this conversation has proved. And one of the things you wanted to discuss was the tension in Machiavelli between thinking historically and thinking philosophically. And I drew out a quote where he says, as for intellectual training, a prince must read history. So what's your view on this sort of tension between historical thinking and philosophical thinking?
I think as far as it works out in Machiavelli, you can, like that quote you said, you can really see how he draws his influences from historical writings and sort of contemporary history rather than philosophy. Like, as far as I'm aware, he doesn't mention any philosophers. He alludes to philosophical thinking, like when I earlier on in this pod, I talked about that section near the start where he says, "All right, let's forget about going from principles, going from kind of preconceived ethical notions first, and then into politics." But he does mention historians a lot. Like he mentions by name and quotes Livy and Tacitus, to ancient Roman historians, and the whole book is just littered with historical examples, like you mentioned. And I feel like it wouldn't be the same book if it weren't for these examples. The reason how he got those realpolitik principles is because of his historical understanding. I think that's the necessary building block for the sort of stuff he's talking about there. And I think in large part, it does tie into that quote that you said, as for intellectual training, a prince must read history. And when you go on with that quote, I don't have it in front of me, but I can kind of remember what he was talking about there. He says, from the deeds of great rulers, you can see how you're meant to do it in practical terms. If you read biographies of people who ruled before you, like, for example, Julius Caesar was obsessed with Alexander the Great. He knew everything about Alexander the Great in his life, and he modeled his own actions after the things that he did. And while he ended up having quite a bit of military success, and it goes on from there as well. You look at Napoleon, and Napoleon was obsessed with Julius Caesar. And per Machiavelli, having a deep historical understanding as a ruler can only help you because you can see where people went right and where people went wrong, and you have a greater frame of reference for the sort of actions you're going to have to do to maintain your power and stability.
That's all really interesting. I think as you were saying that, I was recalling that, as I said earlier, Machiavelli has informed what's called realism in international politics. And one of the assumptions of realism is that basically history doesn't change. I mean, there's this view in like liberal international relations that we're on a sort of progressive train where human nature is malleable and we don't really have the same problems as we had in the 1500s because, fundamentally we've improved the human condition. And so all these lessons that Machiavelli is talking about, they're not applicable today. Whereas a realist would say, no, like, history really just repeats itself. These lessons are sort of timeless. And as you said, like, A good ruler is going to go and read previous rulers, successful rulers, and read history and be aware of these lessons, because these lessons, no matter whether they're in, 2022 or the 1500s or even earlier than that, they're timeless and they're eternal. Political power really does not differ across the ages.
And what do you think about that? Do you agree or disagree with that?
I agree. And I think one of the things that has caused a lot of problems in contemporary global politics is the forgetting of that, and the forgetting of basically the timeless nature of realpolitik. And we see that in the invasion of Ukraine, is that people sort of naively thought after the end of the Cold War that the world was going to move towards liberal democracy and states weren't going to be concerned with realpolitik anymore. They were going to be concerned with human rights and economic prosperity. But really, underpinning all of that is the need for survival and the need for security. And if you forget these timeless lessons of realpolitik, that leads to bad outcomes. It leads to invasions that might have otherwise been avoidable. And just another thing, it's interesting that you mentioned political biographies, because I do love reading political biographies, and I've recently finished a biography on Australia's former Prime Minister during the 1990s, Paul Keating. And Paul Keating's an interesting guy because he never went to university. He left school at the age of 14, and then at 25, he was Member of Parliament. And then before he was 30, he was a minister. And then by 47, he was prime minister. But he had no formal education beyond the age of 14. But something that he did do was he devoured political biographies. And in his own words, his political hero was Winston Churchill. And he looked at Winston Churchill and Roosevelt, and he saw in them great leaders, and he picked up timeless lessons. And I think that's a very interesting approach to politics, because you might want to say, well, their contexts are so different. What can an Australian prime minister learn from Winston Churchill? But again, it's this idea that power politics is the same, and these lessons are timeless. And really, if you want to be a good ruler, you should read previous rulers.
No, I agree completely. And on that thing you said earlier about, we, by and large, the West moves into this kind of liberal internationalist understanding. And I think if you ask Machiavelli about that, he'd say, yeah, the reason why that happened after the Cold War is because the United States could afford it for some time. They wouldn't be thinking like that if they were still in a massive geopolitical competition.
Oh, absolutely.
Now that you see, the Russia reasserting itself and China on its up and up, you can see this sort of thinking making a return. We can see kind of realist ideas becoming more and more popular. Maybe not popular, but they're gaining a sort of following that I can't imagine was as big in the 90s.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, realism in the 90s was really in the doghouse, and it was sort of liberal internationalism was the only game in town. And yeah, you're right. These ideas are making a comeback. They've got greater currency now. I mean, that clip of Mearsheimer predicting that Ukraine would be wrecked by Russia if it went closer and closer towards the West, and he said this in 2014, that went viral after Russia invaded Ukraine. And so people are sort of begrudgingly accepting that, okay, maybe we don't like them, but maybe these realists have a point. Maybe politics is about power. But I think another crucial thing that you said there is, yes, I mean, if you are someone or a state that cares about these sort of things, it's because you have the luxury to do so. And there's a term that I really don't like, but it has a lot of currency in politics, particularly left-wing politics. It's this term post-materialism. And the idea is there that certain people care about things which aren't material. And there's a really good article by Terry Eagleton on materialism, and he talks about those sort of people. And he goes, no, this is not disproving of materialism, that some people don't care about their material interests. If you look at people who do not care about their material interests, who are these people? They're people who, because they are secure enough, because they have enough wealth, can afford to care about other things. And he says this actually reinforces the materialist position because it is proof of the materialist's main argument that morality, that culture, that law, all these sort of things, all these considerations come from the material base. First of all, you need power, then you need material support, and only then can we have these other discussions about culture and morality.
Yeah, for sure. And going on from that, it's, we have been touching on this point about the applicability of Machiavelli's thought to like contemporary politics. But what do you think about this? I was thinking when I was reading it that he hammers on again and again how as a ruler you should concern yourself first and foremost with military affairs. You should make sure that you have an army that's directly under your control, that they're loyal to you, that they're constantly drilling, that it's well equipped, that it's expanding, and that you are continually kind of developing your martial prowess as a ruler. What do you think about that in terms of the modern day? Because I was thinking someone could respond to this with, oh yeah, it's all well and good when you're fighting with spears and maybe some muskets, but when we're in the age of nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles, how does that pan out? Does the concern with kind of military might and military prowess still stand in terms of being a ruler?
I think so. I mean, I think that security is first and foremost to any state, but not all states are created equal. I mean, so Australian prime ministers or Canadian prime ministers or New Zealand prime ministers spend a lot less time talking about these sort of things than the leaders of other countries do. But, go to Israel or go to a country which borders Russia today. Look at what the discussion that's taking place in Finland and Sweden. Even in Kazakhstan, I just recently met a Kazakh who was saying that even in Kazakhstan, they're scared of Russia now because of what's going on in Ukraine. Or look at South Korea, who borders North Korea. These states know that violence is always just around the corner, and that if you want to have a successful state, you have to be able to defend yourself. But are you asking, does the presence of nuclear weapons kind of make conventional forces irrelevant?
Yeah, in a sense, because I'm just thinking that would that completely change the calculus in terms of how states relate to one another? Not everybody can become a nuclear state, whereas I think if you were reading Machiavelli in terms of understanding his time and where he was writing it, he would probably say, well, if you're in or sort of around Europe or the Mediterranean world or something, you could probably build yourself up into becoming a military power that can assert yourself against other states and maintain your own security. But if you're, I don't know, East Timor, you're probably not going to be able to get a nuke.
Well, I think it's interesting because he does discuss at length how to defend your state. And he basically says, well, if your people like you, your people are loyal to you, and you have really good defenses, then you can weather almost anything. Even if a state that is far more powerful than you attacks you, provided that your people are loyal and that you have good defenses, you're basically unassailable. And I think Ukraine is an interesting example where everyone expected Russia to really just completely topple the Ukrainian government in less than a week. And how many months has it been now that this war's been going on? I mean, it's really quite astounding that Ukraine has been able to hold back one of the greatest militaries in human history. And Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons. They've done this conventionally, but you still see a reluctance from Russia to use nuclear weapons. I mean, they have sort of hinted, they like to remind people that they have them. But really, Ukraine is, and you look at the popularity of Zelensky as well, they're doing a pretty good job with their relatively meager conventional forces holding back a superior Russian invading force. And I think that would speak to Machiavelli's point that defense is easier than offense.
Well, so that is a good point because it does tie into the thing about military prowess. Yeah, like you said, I remember going into the war and I myself thought like, oh, this is going to be a wrap. But then it just kept going on and extending. And I saw someone write something online about the fact that Ukraine's military, it's not very big and well equipped, but it has been fighting a civil war since 2014. So everybody in it, uh, barring the people who were recently conscripted, actually do have combat experience. The officers, all the brass leading up to the top, have actual military experience. So that does, I feel, support Machiavelli's point of, well, if you spend your time worrying about becoming a ruler who cares about his military prowess, you're going to be sticking around. And yeah, like you said, Zelensky and Ukraine have been sticking around.
Yeah, I think if you're the leader of a small state, reading Machiavelli and observing Ukraine, you might be quietly buoyed and confident that, well, actually, we do have a chance of defending ourselves. But that's, international politics. Does any of this really hold for like contemporary domestic politics, especially in places like the West, the liberal democracies, where we like to think that, oh, we're so civilized. Politics is about more than power. Politics is about the good life and how we should live. Does Machiavelli like have any influence for leaders today leading in like liberal democracies, do you think?
Oh, 100%. There's a book I read that draws heavily on Machiavelli. It's called The Dictator's Handbook by two political scientists, Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and another guy, I think Alistair Smith. Um, it's a really corny title. I'm pretty sure I don't know, maybe the publisher came up with it or something. But it's a really great book that goes into, in a very Machiavellian sense, here is how you exercise political. This is how political power works domestically. They kind of at the start of the book they go through a survey of political philosophers, and they go, Plato, yeah, sure, didn't really get into the realities of political life, blah blah blah. And they get to Hobbes, and they're like, Hobbes, pretty good, but not 100% there. And Machiavelli, yeah, he nailed it. He pretty much nailed it. And they come up with this theory for domestic politics that they call selectorate theory, which pretty much is just an elaboration of the stuff Machiavelli talks about in The Prince. And in this selectorate theory, there's, I believe, three different groups that are necessary for political survival domestically. You need, well, there's, in the first sense, the broader public. And then within the public, there's what's called the selectorate. And the selectorate are people who actually have a chance, have the ability, have the influence to select who becomes leader. And of the selectorate, there are the essentials or the essential coalition. And those are the people that at bare minimum, you need those people to maintain your power. And they pretty convincingly go through a bunch of different examples to show how this holds and is the case even in developed liberal democracies in the West. They talk about a local council of like this really small city in California where the person who was the head of the council, I think he ended up getting himself into a non-elected position in the council. I think he was town CEO or something. But he ended up staying in power for 25 years of this, small town with a pretty small budget, ended up giving himself like a salary that was higher than the governor of California got, and was able to hold that position because he figured out what small groups of people he needed for support, gave them, in Machiavelli's terms, enough support that enough benefits that they stick around, but not so much they become independently powerful and forget about what you've done for them. Just because of that, like this guy in this small town in California ended up making more money than the governor and staying in power for like 20, 25 years. I think everybody on the council ended up getting arrested and they're all in jail now. And they ended up making laws to sort of circumvent this. But I think it does go to show that sort of these do remain a reality for political life.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't just apply to local councils, I think. Like this is similar, and I think all liberal democracies, if you have a district or an electorate, as we call them in Australia, and it's a safe seat for any political party, then really to get elected to parliament, you don't need to necessarily win the seat. You just need to convince the people in that party that you're a good candidate for that seat. And how do you convince the people in that party? Well, party memberships are pretty small these days. You don't need to like go out and door knock or speak to hundreds of thousands of party members. You really just need to find like, okay, who are the main factional players in my party at this time in this seat? And that might be just like 5 to 10 people. And when you think about it, like to get elected in a democracy, all you have to do is convince 5 to 10 people, and then you can represent an electorate that's like 80,000 people, and you're in parliament. So yeah, I do think that like Machiavelli is right, and this idea of this electorate is pretty spot on.
Yeah, for sure. And even if you are, like Machiavelli says, even if you do want to be driven by principles, you have to get to the point where you can exercise those principles. So of course, that's going to be your primary concern until you get to that point. And in modern democracies, you're probably going to spend your whole political life getting to and maintaining that point. It's not like having an emperor who can kind of single-handedly exercise sovereign power and maybe after a decade or two of being very wise and careful in your actions, you get to that point. Excuse me. In modern political life, you're always going to be turning off people, and you're always going to be trying to get to that point. So it kind of explains why we don't see many quote unquote principled leaders.
Yeah, but as Machiavelli said, violence must be inflicted once for all. And I think you can it doesn't have to be violence per se. I mean, when leaders come into office, they want to get the painful stuff out of the way first. And so we have a new federal government in Australia, and they're releasing a budget later this year. And I strongly suspect that it's going to be a highly unpopular budget. And the calculus for any government or any new government would be, do all the things that people hate first. And so closer to the election, you can do nice things and people will re-elect you, which is pretty much exactly what Machiavelli says. Violence must be inflicted once for all. People will then forget what it tastes like and so be less resentful. Benefits must be conferred gradually, and in that way, they will taste better.
I think that's actually a fantastic example to leave it off. So is there anything else you wanted to say? Or
No, absolutely not. Sorry about the abrupt ending there. Alex and I were discussing what text to do for our next episode, and we decided on State and Revolution by Vladimir Lenin, one of the leading Bolsheviks in the Russian Revolution. It's an extremely interesting book and also hugely important in Marxist-Leninist theory, which influenced not only the Soviet Union, but also continues to have an influence today in China, in the way that the Chinese Communist Party runs the country. So that will be a really, really interesting and important episode. Don't forget, if you enjoyed this, to rate us on your podcast app, on YouTube, to subscribe to the Substack, follow us on Twitter or Instagram, or both, ideally, and to share the podcast with a few of your friends who you think might be interested. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.